What's up, guys? Today I'm bringing you an exclusive interview with Dr. Marc Bubbs. So he's a world-renowned naturopathic doctor and the nutritionist for Canada men's basketball. Does a lot of high-level consulting with professional athletes, Olympic athletes. So, this is the type of consultation that athletes will pay hundreds, if not thousands of dollars for. So I want to make sure that you guys are taking notes and really paying attention to everything that Dr. Bubbs has to say. So in part one, we are looking at how to lose fat. So how are we going to get nice and lean without losing muscle, without sacrificing our performance, but getting that optimal body composition? Let's get to the interview. Okay, guys. So today we got Dr. Bubbs here to give you guys some insight on macronutrient needs and kind of point you guys in the right direction. Dr. Bubbs is very high up in this field, very well respected, works with Canada basketball, and so he trains a lot of high-level athletes or does the nutrition for a lot of high-level athletes. So thanks for being here, Dr. Bubbs.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, so what I wanted to do is break it down to the questions that I get the most. And so we have 3 player examples. Player 1 needs to lose fat while maintaining muscle mass. So I'll let you take the stage and kind of give us some recommendations on what this player needs.
Awesome. Yeah, I think anytime we're talking about, a player, whether they're trying to gain weight, lose weight, maintain through the season, we always want to start with that idea of context. Who are we talking about in this situation? Is the athlete a high school athlete, a collegiate athlete, professional basketball player? That's going to influence the suggestions. What time of year is it? In this scenario, we're trying to lose body fat. We're trying to maintain muscle mass. Is it the off season? Because that would be the preferable time for us to be able to do that. So we have a larger block of time. We can begin the process that we'll walk you guys through here in a minute, or perhaps it's the preseason. Now, if it's in season, there might be a few different adjustments that we'd have to make. So again, considering not only the individual, but what time of year it is important. And then, of course, position. Are they big? Are they guard? Their role on the team. Are they coming off the bench? Are they a starter? How many minutes are they logging? Because ultimately, that's going to influence their ability to lose weight over the long term. Because when we think about weight loss, we want to understand the principles, because most of the time, whether you're an athlete or if you're a practitioner coach listening in, we tend to talk about the different strategies. So this diet versus that diet, vegan, paleo, low carb, whatever it might be. All of these diets operate by the same principles. And so if we want to lose weight, we need to get into a caloric deficit. Now, the nice part with basketball players is that basketball expends a lot of energy, right? All the stopping, starting, acceleration, deceleration, jumps, change of direction, covering, 3 to 5 kilometers in a game. So these are things that are going to hold a player in good stead throughout the season. So what do we start to do from a nutrition standpoint to be able to help facilitate that fat loss whilst maintaining muscle mass? The first key point about maintaining muscle mass is that resistance training, strength training is going to protect your muscle whilst you're losing weight. So that physical stimulus is so important for the weight loss process, regardless if you're an athlete or if you're in the general population. It's one of the reasons why in the general population, we want those folks to try to do some resistance training, because as you're in this caloric deficit to ultimately lose weight, then resistance training and exercise is going to protect the muscle to prevent you from burning and breaking down that muscle. So what do we do to start out with? The first thing we want to do is be able to set your protein intake. That ultimately means we're going to pick a certain dose of protein that we'd like you to get in. We want you to get used to taking that protein in over the course of a day, ideally divided evenly throughout the day. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, and a few snacks in between. And when we talk about dosing, in the research, it's in metric system, so 1.6 grams per kilogram body weight per day. That's the minimum. The absolute minimum that, even if it's a high school athlete, collegiate athlete, professional athlete, we want that, on your average day, you're always going to hit this 1.6 grams per kilogram per day of protein. Now, that can go all the way up to about, if we talk about pounds, it's easier to think about in pounds, 1 gram per pound body weight. Now, that can seem quite easy to get in if you look at the number, but dividing that out through the day, you start to realize, if you get full quite easily, which is often the case, and for a lot of basketball players, you're going to need to start eating more meals throughout the day. And so typically we'll have a breakfast meal, snack in the mid AM, maybe a post-training shake. We have a lunch meal, snack in the PM in the afternoon. Again, it could be a shake or a high-protein snack, dinner, and sometimes, again, another snack after dinner. So that meal frequency is important when you're active and you're an athlete. Now, the benefits of protein for fat loss are tremendous. I mean, the first one is that it helps with satiety. It makes you feel full, because ultimately when you're trying to lose weight, you're going to get hungry. And that's actually a good sign. Oftentimes people want to try to lose weight without ever feeling hungry, but hunger is the sign that lets you know that your brain is sensing a caloric deficit and it wants you to eat more calories. And ironically, your brain always defends a higher set point, meaning your brain wants you to go back to the weight that you were, which is a little bit problematic sometimes when we talk about fat loss. But this is where protein has such a benefit. When we consume protein, it helps us to feel full. The other big benefit with protein is that when you consume protein, it actually costs your body more calories just to eat it, just to process it. And the technical term is called the thermic effect of food. Basically, this is 3 to 4 times more than carbohydrates or fat. So when you eat protein, you burn more calories just to digest the protein. And the last big benefit with protein intake is around the nutrient density. So eating protein is like having a multivitamin. So if we're looking to get more vitamins, minerals, nutrients in the diet, whether it's animal or plant-based proteins, it's going to allow us to get more of that in. So again, number one, fat loss, set your protein intake. Anywhere from 1.6 grams to 2.2 grams per kilogram per day, or if you prefer pounds, up to 1 gram per pound body weight. And you want to get used to that intake so much so that it just becomes second nature. You don't have to keep thinking about it after 2, 3, 4 weeks. Now, once you set that protein intake, this is where we'll talk about carbohydrates. Now, for team sport athletes, strength and power sport athletes, the general recommendation for carbohydrates, and again, these are starches, things like bread, pasta, rice, root vegetables, as well as things like fruit, vegetables as well, broccoli, cauliflower, etc. 4 to 7 grams per kilogram per day. So again, it's handy to be able to take your body weight, divide it by 2.2. That'll give you your weight in kilograms, and it makes it a bit easier to play off some of these numbers. And the key part with being an elite athlete, an athlete who's trying to push themselves, again, whether you're high school, college, or the pros, is that carbohydrates fuel intense training. And so this is the trickiest part if you've got a friend or a loved one or a colleague who's lost weight, who's in the general population. In the general population, it's a pretty good strategy is to reduce carbohydrate intake to lose weight. But the rules change as soon as we change the context. If you are an athlete, then we do not want to dramatically reduce the carbohydrates, because that's your main fuel for when you're pushing hard. When you get into that 4th and 5th gear and you need that intensity, you need to accelerate, decelerate, jump, sprint, carbohydrates are crucial. And so, again, if it's the off-season period, this is typically when training demands are highest. And so we're going to increase our carbohydrate intake at that time. Preseason, similarly, demands are going to be higher. And of course, whilst the season's going on, this is actually when there's a bit more rest in between. And so this is when we can start to change the actual intake. And so this is going to be different from individual to individual, right? That 4 to 7 grams per kilogram, some people are going to have to shoot more towards the bottom end, others more towards the top end, depending on what you're doing that day. Do you have an intense 2-a-day session that day? Are you doing a moderate intensity session like a skills day? Well, then you can reduce the carbohydrate intake. And maybe you have a day that's more of a recovery day, more of an aerobic day. And that's a day where you could actually go to the lower end of 4, maybe even less than that, 3 grams per kilogram, to be able to provide that caloric reduction that you need to help to lose weight. But the key take-home message here is that athletes need carbohydrates to fuel training as well as to recover effectively and keep your immune system running well as well. So again, it can be tricky when we start to think about parents, friends, colleagues who might lose weight with a low-carb approach in the general population. That's going to be very different than for athletes. If we shift gears here to fat intake, if we round out the macros, this is where we can have a little bit more room to play, right? So fats are 9 calories per gram, whereas proteins and carbohydrates that we just talked about are 4 calories per gram. And so when you reduce your fat intake, the caloric intake goes down pretty quick. And so recommendations here, again, can be around 1 gram per kilogram of fat, all the way up to about 1.8 grams per kilogram per day. Or if we think about, when you're calculating these types of macros on your app, you can look at the percentage of calories. So that can be anywhere from 30, 40%, 50% for some individuals. As we're trying to lose weight, we start to pull that down toward 30, maybe even towards 20%. And so some of the easy swaps that you can do, these fat swaps of changing one food source for another that helps to reduce the amount of fat in the food and therefore the caloric intake, that are pretty easy, don't require too much effort, are things like switching from whole fat or regular milk to skim milk, or switching from a regular fat yogurt to a fat-free yogurt. If you're a fan of nuts and nut butters, they're very healthy for you, but things like nut butters, you can eat quite a lot of it, and so it does bring on board a lot of calories, and so limiting those or eliminating those for a period of time can also be a nice, easy strategy. Cheese, again, nutrient-dense source, can be a good source of protein, but this is one that can carry more fat along with it, and so this is where you might start to limit or select certain cheeses that are lower in fat. And lastly would be things like egg yolks. Egg yolks are phenomenal. They're like a multivitamin, but if you're an athlete who's consuming 4, 5, sometimes 6 eggs in one sitting and you're trying to lose weight, this is where we'd say keep 2 yolks in there so you have all the minerals and vitamins that you're looking for, but then you can start to add some egg whites on top of that to reduce that total fat intake and therefore lower your caloric intake. So when we talk about that athlete who's trying to lose body fat whilst maintaining muscle, to sum things up here, the resistance training is going to help to protect muscle mass. You always want to try to lose weight eating as much as possible. If you try to drop your calories too much, you're going to sacrifice muscle mass. And so this is, again, another great example of the difference between the general population and an athlete. In the general population, we might be okay with them losing a little bit of muscle mass, but if you're an athlete, we want to protect that. So you want to try to go slow and steady with your weight loss. And this is why when we talk about tracking and adjustments, a way for you to monitor yourself is to simply weigh yourself, right? Weigh yourself 3 times a week. And then from those 3 times in the week, you want to take an average. So that weekly average is what I use with my athletes. And from week to week, we can then start to see what kind of trends we're seeing. Are we seeing a reduction in body weight? And again, we're only looking for 0.5% to 1% of your body weight loss per week. So for example, you weigh 200 pounds, you're trying to get leaner. We're only looking for 1 to 2 pounds of weight loss a week. So we really want that kind of slow and steady approach. And this is, again, where it can be difficult because all clients and even athletes, we see these things on social media, these 4-week transformations where people tend to, lose a lot of weight, or we see abs, in no time. And again, this is more sizzle than steak, if I can put it that way. We want to basically protect your ability to perform and recover. And so we want a nice, slow, sustained weight loss that'll allow you to perform at your best, to push yourself in training, it'll allow you to recover well. And the really key thing is if you do it like that, once you get to the weight that you want to be at, it's much, much easier to stay there. Because when we look at the research in general population, again, people don't have troubles losing weight. It's keeping it off that's the problem. And so finding, again, that right dietary strategy, get that caloric reduction happening. If you're monitoring week to week, you should be seeing that weight coming down by at least 1 or 2 pounds, or 0.5 to 1% of your body weight. And if you have a week or two where it's exactly the same, where it hasn't budged, well, that's when you need to then make some adjustments. So you need to reduce the caloric intake by about 300 to 400 calories per day, and you should start to see some progress again. And use those suggestions I made with the dietary fat swaps to help reduce caloric intake. And again, you could also then play with the carbohydrate intake. If you see that you're consuming 6 grams per kilo every day, then there's days where you could start to drop that as well to achieve that caloric deficit that you're after. And ultimately, again, the body weight, as well as subjective, you could take pictures, front on, side on, back on, that will also provide you some insights. And with those things, you can start to monitor and then give yourself that time, 3 months, 6 months, a year, to really be able to find that right balance for yourself.
Right. That's perfect. Love it. Okay. Couple follow-up questions. So going back to our first macronutrient, protein, when you say 1.6 to 2.2 kilograms per day or per kilogram per day, is that fat-free mass or is that total body weight?
So that'll be total body weight.
Total body
weight. Just take
okay.
your body weight. If you weigh 100 kilograms, 1.6 grams times 100 kilograms means you're going to consume 160 grams a day. We then say, ideally, we'd like to divide that over 4, 5, 6 meals. And the nice part with that is that even from once you get to the weight you want to be, having that, being able to achieve your protein total, so the total amount we want, as well as the timing, spreading it out through the day, that will allow you to also recover and perform your best down the road.
Mm-hmm. Okay, awesome. And we're going to give you guys a list of good protein sources down below this video. When people hear protein, automatically they think of the powder. Does this mean, hey, I can increase to 2 shakes or 3 shakes, or should I try to keep it at 1 and get the rest through real food? Any general recommendations there?
Great question. And this is where ideally we want to try to eat as much real food as we can, especially when you're trying to lose weight, because eating real food, chewing food, that's going to give your brain the signal that you've eaten. It's going to help you to feel fuller for longer. And so that's goal number 1. Now, people are busy, especially if you're a younger athlete, high school, college, and this is where supplements can be really helpful, right? We think of it as portable nutrition. You can't carry a chicken breast around with you. Well, you've got your shake there with you, or your shaker bottle with your powder, or maybe it's a plant-based powder. And so one thing to consider around protein, if you are more of a plant-based athlete, is that if you're consuming things like beans and lentils, which are a great, very good source of protein, they carry with them carbohydrates that we need to think about in terms of that total calories. And if you're consuming then soy, tofu, or tempeh, which is again a great source of plant-based protein, that brings on board a little bit more fat. So sometimes that's where plant-based athletes can get stuck a little bit. So once you account for that in your carbohydrates and fats sections, then you can tend to overcome some of those roadblocks.
Awesome. Okay, moving down to carbohydrates, simple versus complex. So your simple carbs are, correct me if I'm wrong, your basic kind of sugars, white breads, that kind of stuff. When do we want simple sugars? Do we want simple sugars at all, or should it be complex carbs throughout the entire day? Maybe just give a quick distinction between the complex and the simple.
Yeah, so simple sugars, things like glucose, fructose, so what you might get in a fruit juice, in a sport drink, and candy, these kind of things. Those are going to be your simple sugars. We're trying to limit those simple sugars to before, during, after exercise. And the exception there would actually be things like fruit. So fruit has fiber in it, and so that can be a nice carbohydrate source any time of day. You'll have a good slow release of sugars into the bloodstream. But when we think of, again, candy, confectionery, juice, sport drinks, that type of thing, this is where we really want to think of pre-training, during training, or after training. Now, if we're talking about player 1 here with a fat loss goal, typically we're going to want to dial things back and really be drinking primarily water. Because if we fuel you appropriately before your training session, so you have breakfast before you head off to training, or you have your lunch before your afternoon session, or before a game, we should be able to fuel you with primarily water, and then on the back end of that practice session, be able to provide more complex carbohydrates, which is, again, our breads, pasta, rices, root vegetables, like sweet potato, white potatoes. And so finding a mix of different carbohydrate sources. And So, another point to emphasize is that some carbohydrate sources like rice or pasta will actually have a lot of carbohydrates in them per cup. So again, 2 cups of rice might get you 90 grams of carbs, whereas 2 cups of white potatoes might only get you 50 grams of carbs. And so sometimes we can just swap out rices and pastas for things like potatoes, sweet potatoes, root vegetables like beets or carrots, and you can still have the same size food on your plate, but all of a sudden there's less carbohydrate and therefore less calories. And so some of those little swaps can be handy to be able to reduce your caloric intake.
Awesome. Yeah. So for pre-workout and post-workout, did you say fruit is okay, even though it could be considered more complex?
Yeah, and this is where again it'll depend on the individual. If we're in a fat loss, client, fruit's typically fine before a session. You definitely want to stay away from kind of sport drinks and things like that before sessions if you're trying to lose body fat, because if you consume it a little bit too much beforehand, you can have your blood sugars go way up, and then by the time you get to training or practice, your blood sugars will actually be quite low, and it'll impair your ability to even use body fat stores or the fat in your muscles as a fuel source. So fruit's great pre-training. If you're more on the weight loss side of things or you're struggling, then this is where choosing fruits like berries, which for a cup of berries you might have, again, 14, 15, 20 grams of carbohydrates versus a couple of bananas, which might give you 60 grams of carbohydrates.
Yeah.
So you can start to play with the types of fruits. And as you track things and you can see the amounts of carbohydrates and calories, you can get a sense of which ones to include beforehand or afterwards. And the nice part is as you get leaner, typically we start to add more carbohydrate back in to be able to fuel you and to recover well, and you'll be able to maintain that new body weight more effectively.
Right. Awesome. Okay. And then for fat intake, are there good fats, bad fats? Are we trying to avoid trans fats? Are we trying to get a certain amount of saturated fats? Or are we trying to avoid that completely? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, the easiest message around fats is to think of processed food versus non-processed food. And so most of the trans fats that we get are when you heat up fats really hot, like when you deep fry French fries. If you're not using the right types of oils, it creates what's called a trans fat. So the fat twists and it becomes toxic to the body, which means it's going to impede things like recovery and health more so as we get older, but it does impact the body. And so we're looking for natural sources of fats. So from the animal proteins that you're eating, from the vegetable plant-based proteins that you're eating, from food sources like avocados or nuts or dairy, oils like olive oil, walnut oil, macadamia oil. These types of oils is where we would want to get our fat intakes. When we look at saturated fat, this is where, again, most of the time people will consume too much saturated fat because of the processed food intake is really high. So if you're eating out a lot of fast food, that's the one that can start to drive that up a little bit too high. And that might be more problematic for our more mature athletes getting into the 20s, 30s, etc. But otherwise, whole food sources, your saturated fats are going to be things like butter, coconut oil, and again, the fats that you consume when you're having not just animal proteins, but even things like nuts, because all foods contain a mix of the saturated fats, the monounsaturated fats, and the polyunsaturated fats. So those monounsaturated fats, to give you a few examples, again, things like avocados, olive oil are fantastic. A lot of nuts, things like almonds, walnuts as well. And then the last category there, the polyunsaturated fats, we'll typically want to try to get these in terms of our omega-3s. When you hear about omega-3s, that's a polyunsaturated fat, and we get that from, again, cold water fatty fish like your salmon, mackerel, anchovies, sardines, herring. You get it from seafood. So if you haven't experimented with seafoods as much, things like oysters, mussels, scallops, tremendous sources. And of course, things like grass-fed meats as well. You'll have a good source of omega-3s. The omega-6s, we tend to get a lot of those in just our environment. So again, the foods that you would, if you're eating any kind of packaged food, there'll be more omega-6s in there. And so we don't need to necessarily try to actively add those in. We tend to get plenty from our diets with the foods that we're eating.
Okay. Awesome. And then for this athlete who's trying to lose some fat while maintaining muscle mass, are there any essential supplements or any that you would recommend?
So again, the first two things when we talk about, hey, I want to get leaner, but I want to protect my muscle, is keep lifting weights. Absolutely. Keep the resistance training going. Avoid a large caloric deficit. So don't think, hey, I'm going to lose weight. And we see this with even very elite professional, even Olympic level athletes. If I'm going to lose weight, I'm going to drop my caloric intake by 800 calories a day. That's not the right approach for protecting your muscle. Mm-hmm. That's going to lead to losses of muscle mass. So keep up the resistance training. Make sure you're trying to eat as much food whilst losing weight. So you're taking that slow, steady approach. And when we talk about supplements, I mean, this is where we need to achieve that protein intake. So portable nutrition becomes really handy, right? So being able to have that protein shake, whether it's animal or plant-based, whether it's a whey protein or a vegan protein, that's really great, because if we want you to eat 6 times in a day, that could be difficult to maintain for a while. And so that makes it pretty handy for athletes. So that would be one to definitely think about. And again, one thing to just for practitioners or even athletes to consider, if you are taking creatine, there'll be some changes in water weight. So if you're doing this fat loss process in the off season, it can be beneficial at the outset to come off that creatine, so we can get a sense of how much water might be held there by the individual. Typically takes about 4 weeks for any of that excess water to come out completely, and then it'll give us a better sense of how your diet's really impacting your weight, and how we can then see those changes in terms of weight reduction over time.
Okay.